In 1895, the youngest son of America's richest family opened the doors to a house that defied logic. It was not in New York, where power concentrated. It was not in Newport, where society preened. It was in the remote, rugged wilderness of the North Carolina mountains. George Washington Vanderbilt II did not build a fortress to keep people out, nor a stage to show himself off. He built a fantasy, a 250-room French Renaissance chateau dropped into the middle of Appalachia. Yet today, while the great Vanderbilt palaces of Fifth Avenue are gone, demolished to make way for department stores and office towers, this improbable castle in the woods remains. It is still the largest private home ever constructed on American soil. The story of the Biltmore estate is not just a story of limitless wealth. It is a story of a shy, bookish intellectual who burned through a fortune to create a utopian village, and the desperate, century-long struggle of his descendants to keep the lights on. From a bachelor's paradise to a Depression-era tourist attraction, the survival of Biltmore reveals the exact moment the Gilded Age died and the modern world began. This is not a simple tour of a big house. This is a lesson in how to build something so massive it threatens to destroy you. If you enjoy these deep dives into the architecture of the American elite, please like this video and subscribe. Your support keeps these documentaries coming. Now let's head to Asheville, the unlikely builder, the quiet Vanderbilt. George Washington Vanderbilt II was born in 1862, the youngest of 8 children. By the time he came of age, the hard work of empire building was done. His grandfather, the Commodore, had seized the railroads. His father, William Henry, had doubled the fortune. George was not a businessman. He was a collector, a scholar, a man who preferred the company of books to the chaos of the boardroom. While his brothers were building marble palaces in Manhattan and competing for social dominance, George was traveling Europe, learning 8 languages, and amassing a library that would eventually hold 23,000 volumes. He was introverted, possibly lonely, and possessed an inheritance that in today's terms would exceed $1 billion. He had the means to do anything, and what he wanted was escape. In 1888, he visited Asheville, North Carolina, with his mother. The mountain air was considered restorative. The landscape was wild, unkempt, and cheap. George looked at the Blue Ridge Mountains and saw a canvas. He didn't just want a summer home. He wanted to create a self-sustaining feudal estate, a collision of European high culture and American agricultural science. He began buying land, secretly at first, then openly. 50 acres became 500, then 2,000. Eventually, he would own 125,000 acres, a landmass nearly the size of Chicago. To realize this vision, he hired the 2 greatest creative minds of the 19th century, the architect Richard Morris Hunt and the landscape architect Frederick Olmsted. Hunt was the man who built the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty and the facade of the Met Museum. Olmsted had designed Central Park. Together, they would attempt the impossible, transforming a ravaged, deforested landscape into an English park, and placing at its center a limestone behemoth that rivaled the chateaus of the Loire Valley, the logistics of impossible luxury. Construction began in 1889. The logistics were staggering. Asheville was a backwater. There were no factories capable of producing the materials Hunt required, no artisans skilled enough to execute his designs. So Vanderbilt built them. He constructed a private 3-mile railroad spur, just to haul materials to the site. He built a woodworking factory, a brick kiln that produced 32,000 bricks a day. He imported hundreds of stonemasons and artisans, many from Europe, housing them in a temporary village that had better amenities than most permanent towns in the region. The house rose from the earth like a monolith. The foundation alone required digging down 29 feet into the rock. The walls were load-bearing Indiana limestone, transported by rail, then by wagon. This was not a facade. This was solid masonry. The scale is hard to comprehend without numbers. The house has a footprint of 4 acres, 178,000 square feet of living space, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms at a time when most Americans still used outhouses, 65 fireplaces, and an indoor swimming pool with underwater lighting in 1895. But Biltmore was more than just big. It was a technological marvel. George was obsessed with modernity. The house was fully electrified from day one, powered by a DC generator in the basement. It had a central heating system, mechanical refrigeration, and an internal telephone exchange. It had Otis elevators. It was a machine for living, disguised as a Renaissance castle. The centerpiece was the banquet hall, 7 stories high, a pipe organ in the loft, a triple fireplace that could roast enormous logs. It was designed to intimidate, to awe, to make guests feel small in the presence of history. Yet George spent most of his time in the library. This room, with its walnut paneling and 2-story ceiling, was the heart of the house. It contains a chess set that belonged to Napoleon. It features a ceiling painting brought from a Venetian palace. This was where the real George lived, surrounded by the culture he bought, safe from the world he avoided, the village and the vision. Biltmore was not just a house, it was a town. Olmsted advised George that the soil was poor, the land ruined by previous farming. He suggested George start a forestry school, the first in America, and manage the timber scientifically. George agreed. He built Biltmore Village outside the estate gates to house his workers. It was a model company town, with a church, a hospital, and a school, all designed in a cohesive architectural style. George was playing the benevolent lord. He paid better wages than anyone in the South. He treated his staff with dignity, but this paternalism came at a cost. The estate was hemorrhaging money. The construction cost alone was estimated at $5 million, roughly $160 million today. But the operating costs were the real killer. A staff of 400 was required to run the house and grounds. The forestry operations, while pioneering, were slow to turn a profit. George was spending his principal. By the early 1900s, the financial strain was showing. The income tax, introduced in 1913, was the final blow to the Gilded Age business model of infinite accumulation. But before the taxman came, tragedy struck. The end of the era. In 1914, George Washington Vanderbilt died suddenly of complications from an appendectomy. He was 51 years old. He left behind a widow, Edith, and a teenage daughter, Cornelia. And he left behind an estate that was essentially a financial black hole. The timing was catastrophic. World War I was beginning. The era of the great country estate was over. Edith was forced to sell. She sold 86,000 acres of the pristine forest George had cultivated to the federal government for a fraction of its value. This land became the nucleus of the Pisgah National Forest. It was a conservation victory, but a financial defeat for the family. Edith closed up the main house. She moved into a smaller cottage on the grounds. The great chateau stood silent, the tapestries fading, the pipes cold. It seemed Biltmore was destined to follow the path of the other great mansions, decay, abandonment, and eventual demolition. The pivot, survival by admission ticket. In 1924, Cornelia Vanderbilt married a British diplomat named John Francis Amherst Cecil. They returned to Biltmore to live, but the math still didn't work. The Great Depression hit in 1929. The upkeep was impossible. In 1930, the city of Asheville asked the family if they would consider opening the house to the public to boost local tourism. It was a radical idea. The Vanderbilts were private people. The idea of strangers tramping through their drawing rooms was anathema to the old social codes, but the alternative was losing the house. On March 15, 1930, Biltmore opened its doors. Admission was $2. Visitors came. They marveled at the scale, the art, the glimpse into a life that was already becoming a myth. The admission fees paid the taxes. The tourists paid for the roof repairs. The Cecils had realized what the Fricks and Astors had not. In the 20th century, a castle could not survive as a home. It had to become a business, the modern legacy. Today, Biltmore is still owned by George Vanderbilt's descendants. It receives 1.4 million visitors a year. It is a well-oiled machine of hospitality, with hotels, a winery, and restaurants. But the house itself remains frozen in 1895. You can walk through the bachelor's wing, where George hosted his male friends for cigars and billiards. You can see the Halloween room, with its bizarre, trippy murals painted for a party in the 1920s. You can descend into the basement to see the kitchens, the laundry rooms, the guts of the operation. Unlike the Frick collection, which became a sterile museum, Biltmore feels lived in. There are still photos on the desks. The table is still set. It captures the melancholy of the Gilded Age better than any other building in America, the ambition, the excess, and the ultimate futility of trying to build a European aristocracy in the American South. George Vanderbilt failed to create a self-sustaining feudal estate, but he succeeded in building something permanent. He built a house so large, so beautiful, and so expensive that his family had no choice but to share it with the world, and in doing so, they saved it.